All right, so today you're going to be back to a little calculator work. Should be pretty easy again. We're going to be working with our trig functions, but we're going to actually introduce some new trig functions. They're kind of the same, but these are called inverse trig functions. Basically, they undo the trig functions. So inverses, remember, undo each other. So the inverse of multiply is divide. The inverse of add is subtract. Right? When we're solving equations, we do inverses, the opposite, to solve it. Right? If I have a number times a letter, then I need to divide by that to solve for that letter. Right? So in this case, let's look at a problem. This is the type of problem that you're going to do for me today. It says the sine of A equals 0.8693. Well, what does that mean? Remember what I put in an angle, and I get out two sides being divided. In this case, the opposite side being divided by the hypotenuse. So this says that I have some triangle, and I have an angle A, and I'm not sure how many degrees that angle is. But apparently, when I put that in for the sine, it's going to divide the opposite and hypotenuse side. So it's going to divide this side by this side. And when it does that, it's going to spit out that number, right? And so there is a very specific triangle with this angle. When I divide those two sides, I'm going to get that number. Well, what I want to do then is I want to solve this. I want to use some algebra, right? When we do our algebra, we always do the opposite. And this is what I want to solve for. I want to find what that angle is. I want to solve for A. And when we solve equations, again, we always do the opposite, right? And so here, the opposite of multiply is divide. And so I divide. And remember, multiply and divide, they undo each other. They cancel out and just leave x. And then whatever you do to one side, you do to the other. And so if I'm solving for A, what I need to do is I need to find something that will cancel out the sign. I need an inverse or an opposite operation. And we have one of those. We did not get very creative when we did it. Here, multiply and divide, they have different names. It kind of sound different, right? They're inverse operations. But what we came up with was just the inverse sign. Right? That's the opposite operation that we're going to use. We also didn't come up with a creative way to write it. Multiply, we have the times sign or the x or all these things. We've got divide. We've got a little divide sign. We've got some different ways to write though. Here's how we write the inverse sign, the opposite operation of sign. It's just with a little -1 above it. Kind of weird, right? So the inverse sign. Now remember, if I have multiply, what am I going to do to it? Divide, and it'll cancel it out. So if I want to cancel out the sign, what am I going to do to it? Inverse sign. Inverse sign and sign cancel out. But if you do it to one side, you got to do it to the other. So I need to do the inverse sign of that number. And it just so happens you have that function on your calculator. You have the inverse sine function on your calculator. Generally, depending on your calculator, it's usually right above the regular sine, cosine, tangent buttons, right? So on this particular calculator, it's above them in green. That means I have to hit the second button. It's usually the second function of the button. And so in this case, I hit the second button, and then I hit that little sign with a -1. Right? It looks just like that. Hit sign of -1, and then I put in my number, 0.8693, and it spits a number out. In this case, it spit out 60.4. Actually, the decimal goes on for a little while, but I'm just rounding. 60.4 rounded to the nearest tenth. Well, what is that? Well, remember with the regular sine function, you put in an angle, and you get out two sides being divided. So with the inverse sine function, you put in two sides being divided, and it spits out a angle. Yep, that's what we just did. We just found the angle of that triangle whose opposite and hypotenuse divide to make that. Right? 60.4 degrees. We found an angle. Right? So on your assignment today, that's basically what you're going to be doing. There's not a whole lot of thinking that you really have to do. I tried to explain kind of what's going on there a little bit, but really, when you're solving a problem like this, when you're looking for the angle, you just do the inverse operation, the inverse sine, inverse cosine, inverse tangent of that number. It's all calculator work today. It's going to spit out an angle, so make sure you write your degrees there. but just some calculator work. Find the second function, the inverse function, the little sine -1, cosine -1, tangent -1. That's what you're doing today. You're going to put in the decimal, and it's going to spit out an angle. Remember, we're solving for the angle. We're solving for the missing thing. How do I get rid of sine? Do the inverse sine. They cancel out. Just leaves a. Whatever you do one side, do the other. I do the inverse sine of this guy, spits out that. A equals done. Right? So, little calculator work today. You should fly through it really quickly. Just practicing using the inverse sine, cosine, and tangent buttons.